This story is one of my favorites. I can't remember who first told me this story, but it seems to me that I've known this story since I was very, very small. It could have been my grandfather that told me the story the first time, or it could have been grandfather's grandfather. I really don't remember. But I know that it's a good story because, about 15 years ago, I was asked to go to Deming, where they were having a festival to raise money for a particular purpose, which I'll explain in a minute, and be one of their storytellers. There were, in the mid 1800s, a group of Apaches who had been taken to the reservation at Fort Sumner. Well, some of them were at Fort Sumner. Some of them were in Arizona at a reservation there. Their traditional lands were on the edge of the Gila Wilderness, and their lands actually extended down into Mexico and then up across what's the New Mexico border and into the Gila Wilderness area. And when the railroads were putting trains through, they objected to having an Apache reservation that would come up anywhere close to the train track. And so when they were sending the Apaches back to different reservations, the Mescalero, the Jicarilla, whatever, this group of Apache were broken up into bands, and some of them were sent into reservations in Arizona. Some of them were sent into reservations in New Mexico. Some of them even ended up at Mescalero. But they didn't fit in to any of the reservations they went because they were a totally different group. So for a number of years, since Native Americans, since Apache are no longer required to live on reservations but can live anywhere, many of them have moved back into the Deming area. And they primarily make their livings by the extraordinary arts and crafts, that traditional arts and crafts they do, making drums, painting, sculpture, all different kinds of things like that. Some of these Apache gentlemen, and I even met a few ladies who were doing this kind of stuff. Their work is phenomenal, just absolutely beautiful. So I spent the day going around visiting different galleries where different work was being sold. Wished that I had enough money to buy some of the stuff that I saw there. And talking with some of the artists and that kind of stuff. And then that night, we went to this big hall. Lot of people. There were a lot of local people from Deming, from Hatch, from Hurley, even from Silver City, who were there for this big festival that was raising money for this Apache group to have money to petition the federal government to give them their traditional lands back as a reservation. The land is not like privately owned for the most part. Most of it is either BLM, which is Bureau of Land Management, which means it's owned and managed by the state of New Mexico, or in federal lands like state forests, federal forests and stuff like that. So anyway, we had all gone to this big hall, and there were about 5 or 6 of us that were telling stories of the early days in New Mexico. And there were Billy the Kid stories, and there were Kit Carson stories, and there were my family stories, about the hanging tree and the mysterious stranger, and other family stories that I was telling. And someone beat me to my son Charles's favorite story, which is Tucson Homichi. So I was thinking around about a story I could tell since that story had already been told. And I came up with this one. But because there were so many people there who were not Apache, and not knowing whether they know the Apache way or not, I had to take the time with them and explain a little bit about the Apache way before I could tell the story. And I'm going to do that for you as well because it makes much more sense. The story makes much more sense if you understand a little bit about the Apache way. Now, in my opinion, the Apache way makes a whole lot more sense than the European way. Now, in Europe, if you had a king, the king got married and he had a son, and the son became the next king. And that son got married and he had a son, and that son became the next king. And if you didn't have a son, then you had to go back to your brother, and then your brother became king and his son became king, and so on and so forth. Very unusual to have queens. Mary and Elizabeth the First, and then the next one after that was like Queen Elizabeth. And it's only been in the last, 3 years now that in England they've changed the rules so that daughters can inherit the crown as well as sons, So it doesn't make any difference whether you have a girl or a boy. The next one in line becomes the king or queen. But it still goes in the line down. So from this father to daughter, or from father to son to father to son to father to son to father to daughter, so on and so forth. But that's not the Apache way. Because, you see, sometimes you might have a good king and his son turns out to be a bad king or a mad king. In case of Russia, they had kings who were absolutely insane. And so you didn't know what you were going to get. Maybe the next king was going to be great, maybe not so great. But the Apache don't work it that way. The Apache have a chief. Well, now, nowadays, they elect their chief. So usually it's like the president of the tribal president, tribal council, or whatever. But back 50, 100 years ago, they had tribal chiefs. And it was kind of a hereditary thing too, but not exactly. Because you see, the chief would have daughters. And then they would have kind of a competition. They would look for someone to marry the daughter that could be trained by the present chief and who met the requirements of the tribal elders. So it wasn't just the men in the tribe who decided who was going to be the next chief. The women also had a say in it. Not to mention the daughters, because the daughters had to agree to marry the young man, bring him into the tribe, and he would have to train, and then he would become the chief. They had to be very careful that it was someone the daughter would like, because if he didn't meet her standards, she could divorce him and kick him out, and then they'd have to go find somebody else. So who was going to be the next tribal chief was something the entire community was involved in. A particular clan leader, I don't know that if he was a tribal chief or if he was just the chief or leader of one of the clans. I've never been sure on that. His name was Two Feathers, or at least the name he went by was Two Feathers. So Chief Two Feathers had two daughters, and they were pretty close in age. And when they got to the age that they were marriageable, he and the tribal elders started looking around for someone to choose as their husbands. Well, it causes too much jealousy to choose someone in your clan or band, because this one's parent says, why wasn't my son chosen? And that one's parent says, why wasn't my son chosen? And so they usually go outside of their own band or little group. So this band, Two Feathers Band, was from Mescalero. And so he started sending runners and sending the word out to all of the other Apache bands, the Jicarilla and the whatever. So all of the different tribal areas, all of the reservations received a message that Two Feathers was searching for a husband for each of his daughters. And so young men came from all over. And in the old days, they would show their wealth and their status and all that by giving the chief um, um, horses and bows and knives and guns and stuff like that. But by this time, that had kind of passed away because it wasn't the wealthiest that they were looking for. They were looking for someone who would be a really, really good leader. So as the young men came, they were interviewed and talked to by all of the tribal elders, and the tribal elders would get together, and one would say, well, this young man is lazy and I don't think he would make a good leader. Let's send him home. And another one would say, well, that young man over there is kind of sickly. He doesn't have much stamina, and I don't think he would be a good leader. So let's send him home. And so they had gone through all of the applicants who had come down to vie for the position of the husbands for the young maidens. So it got down to where there were only 2 applicants left. And so the tribal elders called the young women in and they said, well, these 2 young men have passed muster. What do you think? And the young ladies said, well, yeah, they're both okay. Have no problems with either of them. Polite. They show due respect to their elders, and they're kind to the children, and they treat their animals well. And if you think they would make good leaders, we have no objection. So they asked the eldest daughter, whose husband would be the chief, which one do you want? And she said, I don't know. I can't make up my mind. They're both fine young men. I have no way of knowing which would be the best chief. I would ask my father to choose one. Well, the chief had exactly the same dilemma. Here are these 2 young men. Interestingly enough, they were brothers, and they were from the Jicarilla tribe. One of them went by the name of Falling Rock, and the other one went by the name of Gusty Wind. They were brothers. They were tall. They were healthy. They were handsome. They were strong. They were respectful. They had everything that they needed to start their training for being the tribal chief. But the chief simply couldn't decide which one. His daughter had no preference. One would marry the older daughter. One would marry the younger daughter. The older one would be chief. The one that married the younger one would be the war chief. So this was a pretty important decision to make. And so he came up with an idea. And he called the young women in, and he called the elders in, and he called the young men into his lodge. And he said, this is my dilemma. When 2 candidates are so close and have so many of the same good attributes, it's very difficult to make a decision. So what I'm going to do is I am going to give each of you a quest. One will go east and one will go west. And the first one who comes back, having completed your quest, you will marry my older daughter. And the other one will marry my younger daughter. Well, the young men agreed, and so the chief went and spoke to each of them separately and told them what their quest was and sent one east and one west. Well, the young men hadn't been gone out on their quest more than a couple of weeks when along comes Kit Carson. And he calls the elders and the chief together and he explains, I've been ordered to see all of the Apache onto the reservation at Fort Sumner. And so I'm sorry, you must pack up your lodges and your animals and we will escort you to the reservation. But Two Feathers says, we can't leave now, Kit. We've got two young men out on quest to decide who is going to marry my daughter, who's going to be the next chief of the tribe. We can't leave now. We can't leave until they come back from their quest. Well, Kit Carson had his orders, and so he sat down and he and Two Feathers made a treaty. And to the best of my knowledge, this is the only treaty ever made between the United States government and an Indian tribe that has been kept until this very day, never broken. Kit Carson said to Two Feathers, if you will take your band and go to the reservation now peacefully, I will make sure that when someone comes across Gusty Wind or Falling Rock, that they will tell them where you are and take them to the reservation so that you will know who finished the quest first, and there can be a wedding between your daughter and the young man. So Two Feathers and his band loaded up, broke down their hogans, took their animals, and went off to the reservation at Fort Sumner. And they waited. And they waited. Falling Rock never arrived. Gusty Wind never arrived. And they waited, and they waited, and they waited. Finally, the Mescalero Apache came back to their reservation. And still, Falling Rock and Gusty Wind never arrived, never came back from their quest. But the American government to this day hasn't stopped looking for Falling Rock and Gusty Wind. You know how I know? Because everywhere you go in New Mexico and Arizona and Colorado and Utah and even some other states that I've been in, along every roadside, whether it be federal, state, or county roads, you see these signs. Watch for Falling Rock. Gusty winds may exist. Okay, you can laugh now. Do you know how I know that this is a good story? Because when I told the story in Deming at the storytelling, I got lots and lots of laughs from non-Apache. I got lots of smiles and nods from the Apache. But more importantly, after the storytelling was over, when we were having refreshments, more than one of the Apache came up to me and asked me if they could tell my story, because they so much enjoyed it. So I know it's a good story. I hope you enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoy telling it.